So before I begin, I'll tell you guys a little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me. I work for Monotype and I manage all of the Foundry partners who distribute their fonts through Monotype and through third-party or the e-commerce websites that we have. So myfonts, fonts.com, fontshop, linotype.com. I love helping type designers sell their fonts. I love helping people learn more about customers. This is my favorite project I do every year. So very excited to share with everyone. So the font purchasing habits survey ran for 45 days. And everyone who completed the survey got 15 free fonts for making it to the end, which I hope everyone is enjoying those because they're pretty cool. I picked them out. The survey was translated into 6 languages: English, German, French, Japanese, Brazilian Portuguese, Spanish. So that was great. And the survey was really long. There was 82 questions. And of course, the survey results are always released to the public to support the type industry and just help generally get more information out there. To help the survey, get more responses and get a wider audience, we have survey sponsors who partner with us to help share, then spread the word. And so thanks to all these partners. These are the 15 free fonts that people got. Very fun. And the survey's gone for the past 4 years. As you can see, there's been some awesome growth. So this year we had about over 21,000 responses, which is really, really exciting and makes this data set really, really great, really strong. So in the past, I haven't really been able to track where the responses are coming from, but this year I was able to use something called UTM links to attempt to try to see all the different places I shared the survey where we got people from. So you can see that other in black, about 2,200 people, those came from like my social media, people who shared the survey, just a general link to it. You can see that 922 people came from previous survey responses. We can see all the different breakdowns of different social medias under different brands. And then fontsurvey.com is the font survey landing page that I use for this survey project. And then we've got the MyFonts customer email and different things like that. So 140 were at the Foundry email that came through. So this is just trying to share as much as possible about what this data looks like and where these people are coming from. So it's very exciting, great diverse group of responses. So I'll jump right into the demographics. So like, who took the survey? So 71% of people who took the survey use software where they can access alternate characters and OpenType features and fonts. Interestingly, right, 18% don't know if they can do that. 59% have formal design training, 9% are type designers, 48% use fonts from subscription service, 74% have subscriptions to 1 to 5 software design tools. So that's like Photoshop, things like that, Squarespace, etc. 48% were from the US. We have a normally distributed curve for age. So you can see that that's really good. That's exactly what we want to see. 42% are in graphic design, 11% creative director, and so on. And then we have another normally distributed curve here about font knowledge. So most people work with fonts regularly and are comfortable with typography. We have 2 different smaller groups that are limited knowledge and then more advanced knowledge. And so I kind of broke out the subscription one a little bit more here. So 48% said yes, they use fonts. 47% said no, and 6% aren't sure. 37% are in the industry of advertising and marketing. Totally makes sense, right? 10% in education, entertainment, nonprofit, etc. And then we can break it down and look at work environment. So you can see we've got quite a few freelancers, different groups. We have agencies, and that's broken down into small, medium, and large agencies or studios. Companies, small, medium, and large. Educational institution, and other. So the first section we'll go into is just selling fonts, right? Okay, so what do customers want, right? It's important question. And top 3 font features desired by customers is many styles in the family, spacing and kerning, alternates, and ligatures. This hasn't changed much over the years, right? These are kind of core things people really look for and want when they're buying fonts and using fonts. Interestingly, again, this has been consistent over the years. Less than 3% of buyers care about the awards won by the font. So if you're a type designer and you want to do competitions, that's great. You absolutely should, but feel like, you don't feel like you have to do them to get customers, right? They're not necessarily something that directly is connected to sales. And then less than 22% of buyers care about the foundry that designed the font. So I'll kind of go into more detail later about this, but this kind of indicates something interesting about foundry loyalty and what people are, kind of how fonts are seen as a product by customers. So let's talk about evaluating fonts. Okay, so previously we talked about features. Now let's talk about when customers are actually looking at the font. So they want to type out words and phrases. They want to see the entire character set. They want to select fonts to compare with each other. Pretty interesting. Ligatures and alternates, that makes sense, right? We know that they want ligatures and alternates, so when they're testing fonts, they should be able to see if they have them. So, okay. If we go back and we see that 13% say they want to see likes, ratings, reviews, or questions from other users. Pretty low. So I asked a question to try to dive more into that. What kind of user feedback is most helpful? And the most popular one was reviews, but in general, 49% say that user feedback is not helpful for fonts. And that just tells us that e-commerce for fonts is not the same as for other products, right? We know that reviews and star ratings and likes and things like that are really important in other kinds of e-commerce business, especially with physical products. And you see it on Amazon, you see it a lot of places, but with fonts, it may be a bit different. That's what this data might indicate. So when you're thinking about comparing fonts, this is a new question I asked this year. 79% say that they're mostly focused on the general aesthetic quality of the fonts. That's great. People care about design. But closely right after that is 75% say that price is what they're focused on. So it's a balance between the right price and the right design. So those are kind of our top 2. And then you can see below that are some more things that are important. Okay, so why are people purchasing? That's great. We want to know that. So 45% say they needed a font for a project and discovered it while browsing for fonts. Okay. It's pretty much a standard use case, something we could expect. But if you add up some of the other categories that fall under a kind of impulse buy, we see that 34% of the time, fonts are purchased as an impulse buy. That's pretty cool. People just like fonts and want to shop for them and maybe see something they like, buy it, and use it for later. So in general, 6 months after purchasing fonts, 58% say they're happy with them, they're still using them. 26% say they like the fonts, but they've never used them yet. That ties in with the previous data saying maybe they're impulse buys. 11% forgot about them, so sometimes that happens. And then we see some others. So let's talk about pain points. So even though fonts are a mature market, we've still got some fundamental things to improve. For example, finding the right font for their project, testing fonts to make sure they work in the project before purchasing, managing font files. Okay. All right, let's talk about font category. We can get this data from websites, seeing what is most popular in page views, what is most popular in downloads, but I also asked it in the survey to see how this survey data matched with other data we can collect. And sans serif, by far the most popular, and that's consistent with other data we have. And then display, and then 11% don't know, right? And maybe it doesn't matter. So it's kind of something to think about is, we worry a lot about categories and classifications and things like that, but customers may not. So sans serifs are a staple for any library, but variety is essential, right? 42% say sans serif, but there's also 58% of other categories that you need to. So, do you tend to buy single fonts or family packages? When I talk about a family package here, that means a set of multiple font files, like regular, bold, etc. Maybe it's a complete family, maybe it's just a small set with the essentials, but most customers want and buy the family packs of fonts, probably because they want variety when they're designing, things like that. They don't necessarily know which weight of the 400 weights they're going to actually end up using for this particular project, which means for people selling fonts, there's an upsell opportunity that customers actually want. So if you make it easier for customers to buy your fonts in packages, they're probably going to do it. And if we talk about licensing, you know, as last year, desktop license is the top one, and personal use license falls right after that. And this makes sense. However, if you kind of think bigger picture, it's like, how do we define a desktop license? Lots of different licenses out there, lots of different websites selling fonts. Everybody kind of defines it a little bit differently. So I think that it's worth thinking more about in the future, right? Like, what's a desktop license? Some more stats. 73% are more likely to buy a font if they see it used in examples of products or logos. So that could really help you if you're thinking about marketing a font. And 49% look for discounted fonts first when browsing font websites. So. All right, let's dive into variable fonts. Maybe some of you have heard of variable fonts. I define variable fonts as, make sure I get it right here. A variable font is a single font file that allows the user to configure any number of desired font styles. So it's actually an older technology that's become more popular recently, and there's been some technological developments that have allowed it to become more possible in more applications. So I asked a question, as I have for the past 3 years, how do you feel about variable fonts? Optimistic, pessimistic, undecided, or don't even know what they are. So this year, 39% of people don't know what variable fonts are. And that really hasn't changed much over the past 3 years. So you'll see here there's a little bit of variation in these bars, but statistically there's no significant differences between these responses. So really this kind of is a good takeaway to know that we need to do more outreach. There's more education needed about variable fonts, probably more applications to support them before this product becomes viable on a broad scale for like mass market use. So if you break out the survey data into type designers and everyone else, you'll see that's very, very different. And this is consistently like this every year. Type designers really into it, really optimistic, or at least they know about it, whereas the general population still doesn't know what they are yet. So let's talk about free fonts. Free fonts are really important. It's kind of a common thing people talk about and think about with fonts because it's really natural to think of fonts as being free, right? They've come with software, they come with computers. Historically, you know, it's just the general population isn't consciously thinking about fonts every day. That's no problem, right? It's just how things have been. So, and we know that, right, there's a lot of reasons to use free font licensing, things like that, but then there's other reasons where a free font might not work. So I wanted to dive more into, okay, how are customers feeling about fonts and why are people buying or using free fonts? So ask this question about purchase frequency. So how often do you purchase fonts? Most people, 38%, or the largest group in this data, is once every 3 months. We have about 6%, which is 830 responses, saying that they don't purchase fonts. And so to those 830, I asked a follow-up question. So like, why do you not purchase fonts? So we see that they want to pay for fonts if the price is too high, or it's too easy to find great free font options. I don't use fonts enough to justify the cost. I just don't believe in paying for fonts. Fonts should be free. I had just started working with fonts, haven't had the chance. With Adobe fonts, there's no need to buy fonts because Adobe has everything I need, or I already have all the fonts I need, or I don't see the value in paying for fonts. So you can see there's a lot of different reasons why people could not buy fonts. It's worth diving into that more and thinking more about that. So these are pretty important numbers here. 75% say that at some point in the past, when they're starting a project, they decided not to purchase a font, instead used a free font. And then if you think about existing projects, in the past project, I made the active decision to switch from using paid fonts to free fonts. This is like really big numbers here. But the good news is people are still buying fonts, right? Usually my font budget comes from me, my client, company, and only 1% saying, I don't pay for fonts, if you know what I mean, right? Like downloading them illegally. So that's pretty good. People are still buying fonts. So let's talk about font brands. There's quite a few large marketplaces and large font brands out there that people are really familiar with or people are interested in. But before we dive into that, I want to think about foundries versus marketplaces. Foundries are the businesses who create the fonts, and marketplaces are generally the websites, the platforms that sell or distribute fonts. So 47% say that there are a few foundries that are their go-to for fonts, while 80% say that there are a few marketplaces that are their go-to for fonts. So we can kind of see here that there's more marketplace loyalty than there is foundry loyalty. And that 22% stat previously saying, only less than 22% of buyers say that the foundry that designed the typeface is important when they're making the decision to buy. That kind of matches with this data too, right? Like there may not be as much foundry loyalty as we would assume. So what that can mean from a practical standpoint, right? If you have a marketing budget and you're choosing whether to market a new release or your foundry brand, perhaps choose the new release, right? And focus on making that release the best it can be, because that will ultimately help your foundry brand improve. So there's obviously a handful of brands out there that are highly sticky, that are highly popular, but I think this also means that there's a lot of room for new foundries to join the market, create a font that resonates with customers, start selling it on a large marketplace that gets a lot of views, and there's a really good chance that you could like have a successful release still being a brand new brand. So I think that there's a lot of things that you can think about with these numbers. And just thinking about how fonts are kind of a commodity. So if brands are less important with fonts, like the actual brand of the person or company that made the font is slightly less important, and it's more about where the font's coming from, then you can think about that in the sense that, okay, well then pricing is really important, right? Or licensing is really important. So there's just a lot here to unpack, a lot of interesting things that you can think about with these numbers and with this data. Okay, so last 3 years, comparison of the top 10. I did the top 11 for 2018 because we had two that tied for 10th place. Please select all of the suppliers you have used to pay for or download fonts in the past 12 months. Okay, and for 2018, Adobe Typekit subscription and Adobe Typekit Marketplace were separate. For the sake of this comparison, I have combined them into one. You can see that in the asterisk. You can see that generally the big players have stayed the same. And it's really interesting, right? Like it's great when you can finally get enough data to start tracking this over time. And some of you might be thinking back to that big pie chart I showed in the beginning, showing where the survey responses are coming from. And you might be thinking, oh, my fonts is on top. All these tons of the survey responses came through a My Fonts channel. And I thought about that too. And so just to make sure the data was reliable, consistent, that it wasn't being skewed by where the responses are coming from, I did a statistical analysis. This is the only really heavy stats thing I'll put in here, but I made it so that we normalized the data so that each was adding up to 100% rather than this is the the like raw results. This is the normalized data so that it can be compared. The first column shows the responses from people who came through a link that was on a MyFonts channel, email, site ad, bundle page, social media related to MyFonts, something like that. Whereas the second column shows a response that came through any other channel, right? And then the total, which was, you know, both. So you can see that really there's no huge differences here. There's really no statistical differences, statistically significant differences here. MyFonts is only slightly higher from the total when you look at only people that come in through MyFonts. You can see that most are pretty much the same. So that was really good for me to do, also to make sure this data is really relevant. There's a lot of really big websites, and there's a lot of like really other places to find people who use fonts. And the goal is to get as many people as possible from as broad places as possible. So in the future, I encourage everyone to take it, things like that. So, but this is my little stats thing here to just do my due diligence with the data to make sure that it is good, and it is. So the average number of places people shop for fonts is 3. So that means they're shopping at 3 websites, or they're downloading from 3 places, Google Fonts, Adobe Fonts, things like that, that may not be a shopping experience, but they're downloading from. Those are included here. Okay, so survey takers were asked to evaluate the distributors they used to buy fonts. So in the beginning of the survey, they were asked to select the distributors or the marketplaces, suppliers that they've used to download or purchase fonts. And then these 3 questions were asked only, and they were only able to evaluate the ones they've actually used in the past 12 months. And you can see that MyFonts, Adobe Fonts, Google Fonts, are the top 3 for preference and trust, but you can see a bit more diversity in overall experience. It's really cool to see small websites, large websites, websites with high-end brands, websites with mass market brands, all of them can have a really, customers can have a good experience on. So it kind of shows that there's a place in this industry for everyone. That's pretty cool to me. Okay, brand association. This is a popular section for most people. We looked at 8 brands that are fairly well known in the type world, and customers were shown a bank of options. Everybody saw the exact same words, but in each question, everybody saw them randomized. They weren't in the same place in the grid, right? There was a layout for all the different responses they could choose to make sure it was statistically, valid. And then the question was, which word do you most associate with brand, whatever, and the logo was shown. So now I'm going to walk through the results. So which word do you most associate with Monotype? 29% said historic, 23% said expert, and 16% said authority. And you'll see at the bottom of each of these, it shows the percent. This year I added in the option saying never heard of this brand. And you'll see the percent that haven't heard of the brand. MyFonts, 21% convenient, 18% accessible, friendly, and 3% haven't heard of the brand. Fonts.com, accessible, convenient, expert, 24% haven't heard of it. Font Shop, expert, trendy, convenient. It's kind of interesting that expert and trendy are together, right? Usually you don't think of those as being related, not necessarily, but 47% haven't heard of it. Adobe Fonts, we see it there's essentially 5 responses here that are very, very close in percentage: convenient, accessible, expert, trustworthy, and authority. So you could see that this is a bit more distributed than the others, which have really 3 main words that come out, and 6% haven't heard of it. Creative Market, almost 40% say that the word that they think of is trendy, but 40% haven't heard of this brand. Google Fonts, accessible, convenient, 15% haven't heard of it. And FontSpring, accessible, friendly, convenient, but almost 60% haven't heard of it. So for those of you who want to do a quick comparison, I've added this slide. It shows the top 3 responses for each brand. And you can see how they're different, how some of them are similar, right? We can see that some have convenient and accessible seems to be a theme that some brands share. Pretty interesting. And like I said before, all this will be online. You're welcome to go back and look at this later in more detail. I'll pause here to say, be sure to submit questions in the Q&A as we go. We'll get to those at the end. Looking forward to that. Okay, so creative professional. What is this? So as I was looking at this data set was so huge that it became very clear that I could segment this data out in a variety of ways to get different personas and to kind of come up with different customer segments that we can look at. So the main one I wanted to talk about today is creative professional, and I hope in the future to do more of these different personas and look at the differences between them. So a creative professional I define and have defined here as someone who is a creative director, art director, graphic designer, product designer, marketing, UX business owner, working for a company or an agency. So that means no freelancers. It's not a type designer. And they have some kind of formal or type design education. It could be a design workshop, could be a design degree, could be type workshop, etc., but some kind of formal education about design. And then they have an average to advanced knowledge of typography. So when you put all these filters in, you narrow down the data, you get about 3,500 responses. And then we can look at certain questions to see how this group is different from everyone else. Usually my font budget comes from client, me, or my company's marketing or advertising budget. That's different from what we saw before, where the biggest one was me. So this group, 46% of this group thinks that free fonts are lower quality. 97% of people in this persona purchase fonts. 47% work in advertising and marketing. 63% use fonts from subscriptions, and 42% have purchased a font manager to manage their font files. And then if you further segment this data, so you take the 3,500 responses and you break it out into company versus agency, I then asked this follow-up question that was unique to each of these groups. So for a company, which of the following best describes how your organization views fonts? And 51% of people that work in this persona for companies say that they can buy fonts and expense them. And then we have a couple other options here with very low responses. My organization insists fonts be purchased through our IT or procurement team. My organization insists on only using free fonts. Agency partners always provide fonts needed for projects. Our agency partners typically ask us to purchase fonts, right? There's a variety of different ways that businesses work. And then if you look at agencies, it's about 2,000 responses in this persona for agency. You can see that which of the following best describes how your agency views purchasing fonts for clients. So 45% say that my agency purchases fonts for client projects, but does not give the font files to clients. So pretty interesting. My agency sometimes purchases fonts for our clients. My agency never purchases fonts for our clients, or my agency always purchases fonts for our clients. So you can see that there's different ways agencies work when it comes to dealing with fonts and clients. All right, new section here. How well do you know a type designer? So in my day-to-day work, I work with tons of type designers and tons of people selling fonts. So I was really curious, we focus a lot on our customers, but I don't think anyone's ever asked how our customers feel about the people who make fonts. So I decided to ask. As a reminder, 9% of people have created and sold a typeface at some point in their life in this data set. So about 9% are type designers. Okay, last year I simply asked, in 2018, I asked, I personally know someone who's made a font. And that was a yes or no question. But this year I wanted to dive way deeper into it because I know there's a lot of different ways people can interact with the people who make fonts. So we can see the most common is I could name a few type designers, but I don't know any personally. And I couldn't name any type designers, but I know they exist. And I love it. 2% said, I didn't even realize that there are people who make fonts until reading this question. Love it. Well, all of you can say that I have interacted with type designers online or on social media after today because I'm a type designer. So great. And there's plenty of other type designers in the chat here. So if you are interested in meeting type designers, you should talk to people in the chat. 11% say they know one or more type designers well. 10% have met a type designer in person or seen them speak at events. That's pretty interesting. And then we asked 8 different questions here that people were responding to on an agree to disagree scale. So it's pretty interesting. I feel comfortable emailing the designer of a font I've purchased for support. 44% say they agree. I think this should be higher. Type designers are cool. 66% said that they agree that type designers are cool. Type designers understand what customers like me need. 52%. Type designers appreciate my business. Well, I can tell you that they really do. So most type designers are male. I think this is a common misconception that people have just based on history. But type designers do a good job of explaining how to use their fonts. That should probably be higher in my opinion. Type designers are friendly. 43%. That should be higher too. Type designers are intimidating. 47% said disagree. It's pretty good. In general, my experience with type designers, 98% said they've had a positive experience. That's pretty good. So I'll jump in here into my takeaways. And before I get started, I want to share one last thing, which I always share, and I think is very fun. But the question, I think fonts can be sexy. 54% say agree. 23% said some would agree. So past 3 years, people still think fonts are sexy. So it's pretty funny and good. People love this question. Okay, so here are my 4 takeaways. And sometimes I can kind of testify here that it's hard to see the forest for the trees when you have this much data and this much information. So I hope that each of you takes away something unique from this that applies to your particular situation, your work environment, what you're working on. Like there's a lot of gems throughout this presentation that, take what you need. Personally, my takeaways are a bit more broad, right? Not necessarily totally relating to fonts. But this data has really made me realize the importance of thinking about your customer. In general, whether you're in the type industry or not, it's so important to know your customer because your customer might not be the person you think they are. The data shows here that 42% of customers or people that took this survey are graphic designers. But that means that there's 58% of people that are purchasing fonts or using fonts that aren't graphic designers. So I think it's easy to assume that, you're as a type designer, your customer is a graphic designer using this font. But the reality is a lot of different people that are needing to buy and use fonts. So it's important to think about that and think about things from other perspectives. Nothing is as simple as it seems, right? Like that's pretty broad, but like there's always more to the story. I think the data sort of shows that. We all of us have our own worldviews, and like how could we not? We only know what we know and what we are exposed to and what we see, but all these views are too narrow, including my own. So it's important to not make assumptions. Don't follow the crowd. Find out for yourself. Verify things with data. Diversify your social circle. Do something daily if you can to expand your worldview. And as it relates to fonts, this means talking to font users, educating yourself about marketing, business, and the broader design industry. So some things change and some things stay the same. So the font world, many people may not realize, is tied much more closely to the corporate world. So, for example, in traditional font e-commerce, we see lower sales when people aren't working, i.e. weekends or holidays, and more sales when people are at their desks. But right, the world's changing and the corporate world is changing too. Corporations are getting larger, more complex, more international, and fonts are still an important part of branding and design, but they like but they're more and more important as companies struggle to achieve brand consistency as they get more complicated and more larger. But fonts as a software haven't really evolved in a long time. They're still a font file. You still need the proper license to use them appropriately. So from last year, subscription font use, open source font use, and using a font manager has increased. Font users have more complex needs than they used to, and they're looking for a simple solution. So as the world changes, we should try to change too. And some things stay the same, right? For certain questions in this survey, not much has changed over the years. Users still prioritize the same font features like kerning, spacing, ligatures, and alternates. We know how to make fonts that customers will love. The main large font websites are still popular and resonating with customers. People still want to evaluate the same way as they did 4 years ago. We know in general how customers want to shop. Variable fonts still haven't caught on yet. Sans serifs still reign supreme. Desktop licenses are still the most popular. And in general, people are still spending money on fonts. And the overall font industry revenue is continuing to increase. There's plenty of room for new foundries to join and succeed. And most importantly, people still love fonts. So I'm looking forward to the future. And thank you. Okay. I will stop sharing. And we can do a Q&A. Make sure you put them in the Q&A field. Otherwise, I might not get to them in the chat. So let's see. Right. Has there been a change with the I don't know fonts? All right. Has there been a change with the I don't know fonts, if you know what I mean, answer over the years? It's always been really small. I think at one point the highest it's been was like 3% maybe. But it's always been the lowest one. So that's pretty good. All right. Okay, what weights are most successful? Definitely regular, bold, italic, things like that are the standards that you see. But people in general aren't really shopping for weights like they used to, right? People are wanting the whole family. They're wanting all the fonts so they can choose when they're designing what they actually want and need. I think that's why variable fonts could have a really good shot, especially for prototyping when you have unlimited options, simply because people do want more styles. Okay. All right. About language support, you have more than 50% of the answers from the USA. Is there a database to ignore that and see what the rest of the world thinks? Okay, so I think it was, let me go back and look here. So we had 48% from the US, 8% from the UK, 7% from Germany, Canada, Australia, etc. So this is a great candidate for a persona, like I talked about with creative professional, where I can take out the US respondents and maybe compare the US group to the rest of the world group. I've done a little bit of this in the past with past data sets and didn't have enough responses to have statistically significant results, right? It's really hard to compare a set maybe of like the UK, which is 11%, to the US, which is 48%, just really different numbers. But it's definitely something to look into. I also found this year that the translated surveys didn't really resonate with people. We didn't really see a ton of people using them, taking them in different languages. Most people took it in English, even if they weren't in the US. So that tells me something too, that there's more to think about with international font use. Okay. For the foundries and marketplaces included in the data, what is their most effective communication tool to reach their clients? Digital marketing, print advertising, social media, etc. So I can't really speak for everyone here or all the brands that I talked about here, but personally, with sharing the survey, email is huge, right? That's the best way to reach people directly. And you can see that in my pie chart of where I got all my survey responses. Email was definitely the most successful for the different email lists that I had and I was able to use. Social media is good, but historically for certain industries, including fonts, doesn't always drive sales. It drives awareness, which can eventually lead to sales, but I think that email is probably the most direct way right now. So, have you asked about future fonts this year? No, I did not. And I got some tweets about that as well. Essentially, last year or in 2018, my list was like 50, 60 boundaries long or brands long. And it didn't like it. I got negative feedback about that. It was hard to take the survey. It wasn't clear. It was confusing. So I took, based on the results from last year, I took everyone that had more than 4% of responses, which was only this, 15 or whatever that I asked about this year. So, no, they didn't make it in, unfortunately. And quite a few other brands didn't make it in. So what are the leading font manager programs? There's tons out there. It kind of just is, I think it would be based on like what your company uses too. Like, it's a font manager should be an organizational solution. So sort of depends on who else is using it, would be what people was most successful. Extensis, Monotype has a couple different ones. One Mosaic, one is called Sky Fonts. Font Explorer X. There's quite a few in-browser ones. Can't think of their names right now, but there's a couple out there. All right, I see that DeFonts was included in the survey. I thought this to be a pirate site with many stolen fonts on the site. How do you address this as a company? How do you advise your foundries? Wow, that's a tough one, but I can answer it. The DeFonts is not a pirate site. There might be things that end up there that shouldn't be there, but DeFonts is, they're a business and they make money from ads on their site. And if you report something to them, they will take it down. And we have a whole article about font piracy in the Foundry Help Center that I manage, and it gives you exact instructions for how to send a DMCA takedown notice, exactly where to contact tons of different websites that may or may not have accidentally posted something that might infringe on a EULA or a license. So, like, ultimately, right there, my philosophy is that you assume people are not trying to do things bad, right? You assume the best before you assume the worst. So you give people the benefit of the doubt, be kind, be polite, right? When you send things to be taken down. And most likely, most of the cases, people don't realize it's there. They want to take it down. They don't want it to hurt their brand as well. So I think that, right, there's processes in place for this. It's kind of just unfortunate consequence of our industry that we're in. So, okay. All right, let's see here. All right. The survey mentions 8 different sources of acquiring fonts, but none of them got a trustworthy score of 15% or higher. Do you think this is the case? Oh, okay. So when you talk about that score, it's not really a score. It's just the percent of people that said that was the most trustworthy. Because there were so many different ones, those numbers are going to be lower. But if you use those numbers to compare to each other, then you'll see that like 15% was the highest. So whatever it is, right? 20% is the highest. So then you can kind of go from there. What about color fonts? That's a good question. Color fonts haven't seen a ton of popularity lately. There's a few people out there making them, few people out, we've got some customers buying them, but it seems to be still a niche product, I can tell. Okay. Hi there. Thanks for all the research. You're welcome. Do you have any information on seasonal font sales, such as what months see the most purchases? Yeah, actually, well, it varies slightly. I sent out a Foundry newsletter lately that had like a recap of 2019, and it didn't show months of font sales, but it did show months of font releases, like when we get the most releases. We generally see sales in the summer as being a little bit lower, Christmas a little bit lower, when people are taking holidays, when people are taking vacation, we see the Easter weekend is generally lower, things like that. So just kind of using common sense, you can kind of figure it out in terms of just think about when people are working and when they're not. When they're working, best time to release and sell fonts. All right. All right. Aha. Do you have information of how much people are willing to pay per font? A price average of what they feel is not too expensive? Yes, I do. I did not include it in this presentation, but it is in the font survey booklet. Let me just make sure I get the numbers right here. I don't want to provide any bad information. It might take me too long to find it, but it's around $100 for a complete sans serif family, or $115, and about $50 for a complete script family. So that varies, obviously, right? That totally depends on the features of the font, things like that. And we have a whole pricing guide in the Foundry Help Center that you can use to see like where your font is and what kind of price ranges are common for that kind of font. So that question I've asked over the years, those numbers have continuously gotten lower. So people are more and more price conscious lately, and that makes sense because fonts are a commodity. All right, so we're almost at 45 minutes, but I'll do, let's see. Were there any changes? And I decided at some point in time, I don't want to buy fonts compared to previous years. Unfortunately, this is the first year I asked that question, so I don't have results from previous years. Grant, okay. This is from a student in California. So glad you guys could make it. How were you able to increase the number of participants, and how did you come up with new questions? So basically it's finding, growing. Every year it gets more and more, and I think that is just because more and more people are familiar with it. So I think the consistency over time and the repetition of the project, same name, branding is a little different every year, but I think that it's that's been helpful. I think that email lists are really important. So as the survey keeps going, then like there's more. Like, for example, within Monotype, we were doing some research on agency customers, and they had an agency list they could use for research, and they shared that with me. Like a different research team in Monotype shared that with me, and I was able to use that. So it's kind of like as the project is getting bigger and bigger, and more people within Monotype are interested in it too, then it grows as well. So, okay. All right. There's still so many more questions, but I think we're going to have to call it for time right now. Let me take a quick peek at the chat. Okay, there's so many things in the chat. I'll have to look at it later, and I'll get back to everyone with emails if I can answer your question. As a reminder, this will be posted online. The article with images from the presentation will be posted online as well. And you are welcome to email me with any specific questions you have at foundrysupport@myfonts.com, and I can happily answer that for you. Thank you so much for attending. Hope this was helpful. And that is all. Thank you.